Debunking Myths, Refutational Journalism in the Climate Denial Age with Dana Nuccitelli, who is a current writer for Yale Climate Connections. And in this talk, Dana has agreed to do something that he's very, very good at, and I've enjoyed his writing so much. He's going to delineate some of the big climate myths of our day. And, you know, climbing into these myths is part of our job as a climate advocate, is understanding what people have heard, what disinformation is out there, what misinformation is out there, how powerful those messages are, how pervasive those messages are, how even we who understand the science can have these moments where we wonder, maybe something else is true too. And it can work on anyone. It can work on anyone's mind. So he's going to talk about denialism and basically the different journalistic outlets and how they behave. And Dana himself is an environmental scientist, and there are many scientists on this call this morning, so he's in great company. And he is a climate journalist for Yale Climate Connections, as I said, and he's also the author of this really great book, Climatology versus Pseudoscience. So I urge you to check that out. We'll probably put a link to that in the chat later. He received the National Center for Science Education's Friend of the Planet Award in 2016 for his writing on climate change with The Guardian. So some of you might have seen his name as Guardian readers, and now I'll urge you to continue to follow his writing with Yale Climate. So welcome, Dana, and thank you for doing the second headliner that you're doing this week, because your talk about fire on Monday night was just fantastic, and people really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody, for coming this morning. So that covered my bio pretty well. Just a few other items. Backgrounds in physics from Berkeley and Davis. I'm an environmental scientist as my day job, and then that pays the bills. And then on the side, I do my climate journalism. I started with skeptical science in 2010, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today. And then, as Kristen said, The Guardian for about 5 years, 2013 to 2018, and now for Yale Climate Connections for the past 2.5 years. I've done some peer-reviewed climate papers, my book, and I'm a member of Citizen Climate Lobby, CCL, which is a grassroots climate advocacy group in the Sacramento chapter, and I'm the CCL National Science Team lead. So skeptical science is where I got started. It was founded by this Australian guy, John Cook, who has a similar background to me. He's got a master's degree in physics. And he was frequently getting into arguments with his father-in-law about climate change, because his father-in-law was kind of a climate denier. And so his father-in-law would, repeat some climate myth that he had heard, and John would say, that doesn't sound true. And so he would want to go see what the scientific literature said about it, having a scientific background himself. And so he would go on the internet and look for a website that kind of explained the science about these climate myths, and he couldn't find one. And so he decided to just create one himself. And so that was kind of the birth of skeptical science. I think it was around 2007 or so. And so he basically looked at, whenever he heard a new climate myth, he would look at the scientific research and summarize it in kind of plain English and put it into the skeptical science database. And then after a few years, it kind of got to be too big for one person. So he kind of put out a call to get a team put together to help him out. And that's when I joined in 2010. So you can see on the left side of the page, we have a list of the most used climate myths. And then in the database overall, we have somewhere in the ballpark of 200 different climate myths that we have debunked, look at the climate science research, the peer-reviewed research, and explain kind of in plain English what the scientific research says about each myth. So I want to go into a little bit of history of climate denial first. So this is a chart put together in a report, an internal Exxon report in 1982. So actually in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, Exxon was doing some really good climate science research at that time. And so some investigative journalists got a hold of these internal reports. And so this chart is from one of them in 82. And it shows Exxon's prediction, their scientists' prediction of how much carbon dioxide would increase on this left side and how much temperatures would increase on this right side in the future. And so I made a video out of this to kind of compare it to what actually ended up happening. And so there's our two curves with Exxon's carbon dioxide and temperature predictions. And there's in the blue what actually happened with carbon dioxide, how much it actually increased. So they were very close with that. And the red here is how much temperature actually increased. So they were spot on with that. And so it's pretty remarkable how accurate Exxon's internal scientific predictions ended up being. So, I mean, it really goes to show, like, even in the 80s, like, Exxon knew they had a really good idea of what was coming. I mean, at the time, like, I was 1 year old when this happened, and now I'm getting pretty old. I'm like about to turn 40. So, in those nearly 40 years, Exxon kind of had a choice knowing what was coming. What would they do? And unfortunately, what they chose to do was spread misinformation, disinformation, try to undermine policies to address this problem that they identified of climate change. So they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this campaign to sow misinformation, undermine climate policies, undermine public support for climate policies, just make the public kind of doubt that we knew what was going to happen, even though they themselves knew in like almost 40 years ago what was coming down the pipeline. And that's just kind of a common thread among polluting industries. So there's this good book, Doubt is Their Product, that has this quote from a tobacco industry executive in 1969. The executive said, "Doubt's our product since it's the best means for competing with the so-called body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public, and it's a means of establishing a controversy." And then there was a really good book that got turned into a documentary, Merchants of Doubt, by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, that kind of covers these same topics with just this long history of industrial companies, once they learn the dangers of their product to public health, instead of taking action to do something about it, they would engage in this same playbook that the tobacco industry established of just spreading doubt, using fake experts to basically make it seem as though there was uncertainty regarding the harm that their products were going to do, even though their internal science clearly delineated the damages of their products and the health harms of their products. So we had the tobacco industry, there's a bunch of chemical companies, there was DuPont with Teflon, and so there's just a bunch of examples. There was like fire retardant chemicals, and then of course the most recent one being the oil and gas industry. And so it's kind of a byproduct of capitalism that, it's these businesses, they view it as their job to maximize the profitability of their company. And so when you have this, $1 billion product generating tons of profits, and then you find out that it is harming public health, it's in that system, it's really difficult for them to kind of do the right thing and take action that would, cut the company's profits, because that is kind of their job. That's the way we're built, is for them to create profits. And so the end result is that their profits come ahead of public health, and society as a whole, bears the brunt of those impacts as a result. So with climate change, it was really in the 80s that we started to learn a lot about the dangers. And so, Exxon knew in 1982, but there were other climate scientists working on the issue at the time. James Hansen, people are probably familiar with, was basically the top climate scientist in the world. He was the head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. So in the summer of 1988, he testified to Congress about how we knew global warming is happening. Humans are responsible. It's going to be dangerous. It's going to have negative impacts. And so that year, there was a presidential election going on, and the Republican candidate, the first President Bush, promised that he said, "Those who think we're powerless to do anything about the greenhouse effect, forget about the White House effect." So he's basically promising, if I'm elected, I'm going to do something about this climate change issue. And he, of course, was elected. And so that was a good opportunity for us to start doing something about climate change. And that following year, in 1989, there was this international climate conference in Norway. And there were more than 60 countries that were working on an agreement. They were going to plan to commit to freezing emissions at the current levels at that time, 1990, by 2000, so that emissions would not keep going up, at least from those countries. But unfortunately, Bush's chief of staff, this guy named John Sununu, was a pretty hardcore climate denier. I don't think Bush really particularly cared about climate change, but his chief of staff really did. And so his chief of staff, John Sununu, basically got the U.S. People, the folks who were engaged in the negotiations, to sabotage them. And so basically the result of that conference was that they didn't make any concrete commitments. So that was a good opportunity for an international agreement to do something about climate change that really nothing much came of it because of undermining efforts by the United States. I mean, we have a long history of international climate negotiations, people countries making commitments and then not living up to them. So, we could have made these commitments and then just not followed through with them, but at least it would have set a precedent of the United States leading the way in these international climate negotiations, making commitments to do something about it. And instead, the opposite happened. We undermined them, undermined efforts to make commitments. And that was kind of set the precedent. And then Bush's son kind of did the same thing in the 2000s, undermined international climate agreements. And so those efforts have really kind of hamstrung international efforts to do something about climate change. So the fossil fuel industry got really spooked by this, by Hansen testimony, all this improving or advancing climate science research, this international climate negotiation that barely got scuttled, and so they created this group called the Global Climate Coalition in that same year in 1989, which is basically just an organization of a bunch of oil and gas companies whose goal was to kind of undermine climate policies and climate negotiations. And so the main way they did this was through these think tanks that they funded a lot of money to. Heartland Institute, Cato Institute, Heritage Institute, George C. Marshall Institute were kind of the big ones. So basically they would send a bunch of money to these guys, and then these guys would create the perception that there was scientific evidence to support various climate myths, to create doubt about the mainstream climate science. So they did a bunch of bad stuff. The Heartland is kind of notorious that periodically they will send materials to school teachers around the country that are just full of climate denial junk. And then their goal is to get some percentage of teachers in the United States to teach their students climate denial. And they're just going to send this stuff out for free, hoping that the teacher will take this free material and then spread it to their students, which is just pretty evil. So yeah, these guys are kind of the main sources of a lot of climate myths that we've had to work to debunk for a long time. So they're myths. We call them the kind of the ABCs, the anything but carbon. So for a long time, they would try to argue that it's not actually warming. So, once the evidence and the data got overwhelming, they pretty much had to abandon that myth. So they kind of switched to some alternatives. They said, well, maybe it's warming, but it's warm because of the sun. The data didn't support that. So they said, well, maybe it's a natural cycle like the El Nino cycle or something like that. Or, maybe it's like undersea volcanoes pumping carbon into the climate system. Or, one of my favorites is it's galactic cosmic rays, because that's fun to talk about. It's like neutrons from space that come down to Earth, and yeah, that's a fun one to debunk. Then they went back to, well, maybe it has stopped. Maybe the warming has paused. That was a really popular and pervasive one for several years, around 2012 or so. But of course, that didn't pan out. The data debunked that one. So they said, well, maybe it's warm, but maybe it's actually good. Maybe the CO2 is actually plant food and it makes, plants greener. And so that's actually a good thing that we're adding CO2 to the atmosphere. Now we've gotten to the point where I think most climate science denial is pretty ineffective at this point for at least most of the population. Most of the media doesn't take it seriously anymore. So most climate denial arguments at this point focus on kind of saying that the solutions are too expensive, so we can't solve the problem because it's going to cost too much, which also is not accurate, but that's kind of where most of the climate denial myths have gone at this point, away from the science and toward kind of economics sorts of arguments. So probably the peak moment of climate denial was Senator James Inhofe from Oklahoma went to the Senate floor in the winter of 2015 with a snowball in his hand. He was like, "Hey, I got a snowball, so therefore there's no global warming or something like that." I don't know. I don't know what point he was trying to make there. So he's the author of a book that called, like the title is like The Greatest Hoax, something like that, calling climate change the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people or something like that. So he's pretty awful. He's still, unfortunately, a senator from Oklahoma. Yeah, so that was, I would say that's probably like peak climate denial. That was in 2015. Fortunately, also around then is when we got the Paris Agreement. So that was, that was a major blow to climate denial, was like every country in the world saying, look, we're going to try to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. We're going to take serious action. The United States actually agreed to that, which was awesome. We actually finally had like an international climate negotiation that was successful. So that was a really big blow to climate science denial. So I think since then they've been kind of reeling a little bit. But up to that point, they were really helped by media false balance, where a lot of mainstream media outlets felt that they had to give equal time to both sides. So there were a lot of examples like this where they would have these one-on-one debates. CNN was a major culprit of this, where they would bring on one climate realist and one climate denier and have them debate back and forth. Usually the climate realist was Bill Nye, and then they would bring on someone from one of these think tanks like the Heartland Institute that usually wasn't even a scientist. It was usually like a PR person. And they would argue back and forth. And like, if you didn't have a base of climate science knowledge, you wouldn't know who was right. And so for the audience, just created this perception that there was this 50-50 debate, that the science wasn't settled, that, the experts were not in agreement. And so it created this false perception among the public that just the science wasn't settled, which was exactly the strategy that all these industries using, the oil industry using the tobacco playbook was trying to, that was like their goal, was to convince the public that there was uncertainty and doubt. And these, these mainstream media outlets doing these one-on-one debates were doing that job for them. And it was a really frustrating thing. There was actually a really good segment on John Oliver's HBO show Last Week Tonight that addressed this. So I'm just going to let him explain it.
If there has to be a debate about the reality of climate change, and there doesn't, then there is only one mathematically fair way to do it.
Last Week Tonight presents a statistically representative climate change debate.
Good evening. Joining me tonight, a climate change denier and, naturally, Bill Nye Science Guy.
Humans are causing climate change, no question.
Wait. Before we begin, in the interest of mathematical balance, I'm going to bring out 2 people who agree with you, climate skeptic, and Bill Nye, I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists. It's a little unwieldy, but this is the only way you can actually have a representative discussion. Please file in. Again, this is going to make the debate difficult. We shouldn't really be having it in the first place. But representationally, climate skeptic, please make a case against climate change.
Well, I just don't think all the science is in yet. It's settled.
Okay, and what is the overwhelming view of the entire scientific community?
Well,
Okay. Any response to that? Any response? I can't hear you over the weight of scientific evidence. This whole debate should not have happened. I apologise to everyone at home. My thanks to Bill Nye and the overwhelming scientific consensus.
So that's like my favorite video of all time. So fortunately, things have gotten much better. There's no more of those one-on-one debates anymore. Climate scientists really just stopped accepting those debates because they were getting frustrated about the false balance that was happening. And it was taking, so, that's kind of when things got better. But we were, at Skeptical Science, we were getting a little frustrated that we just kept on having to debunk all these myths. And we were playing whack-a-mole all the time. And we weren't making a lot of progress. And so I started writing more about climate policy solutions, economics, politics, things like that. John Cook got a PhD in cognitive science. And he started writing about the psychology of climate denial and doing research on that. And so he and his advisor, Steve Lewandowski, wrote this resource called the Debunking Handbook, which they actually just updated last year in 2020. So if you're interested, you can just Google the Debunking Handbook 2020. Make sure you look at the 2020 version because their original version has been updated a lot as we've learned more about cognitive science. So it's a really good resource for kind of learning how to effectively debunk myths. And so it's got some good information in there. One of the first points they make is that misinformation is really sticky, meaning it kind of sticks around in people's brains. So like an example they give here is like, imagine that your brother, you heard your brother got food poisoning at like an Olive Garden. And then later on you heard that actually wasn't true, that didn't happen. But you might still down the line be kind of wary of eating at Olive Garden because you've got this association still in your mind that there was this food poisoning event that happened at Olive Garden, even though you subsequently learned that didn't happen. But the further away in time you get from that event, think your memory gets a little fuzzy. You think, well, wasn't there something about Olive Garden causing food poisoning? Maybe I should avoid it. And so misinformation kind of has this lingering effect. They call it the continued influence effect, where people just don't they have this vague association, and like it's hard to fully remove the misinformation from people's brains. And so that's kind of what we're fighting against. Another thing we're fighting against is polarization, of course, especially in the United States. We are right now a very, very polarized country. And so if people's positions and beliefs are based on polarization, on what they perceive as their identity, it can be very, very hard to dislodge the misinformation that they believe based on that kind of identity position that they're in. So, it's still sometimes worth trying to, making the effort to debunk the myths that they believe, but it's good to bear in mind that if they associate that misinformation with their identity, you may not be able to make much progress in convincing them they're wrong, despite however much evidence there might be against that position. So a kind of a good example is the January 6th insurrection. I believe that polling has showed a majority of Republicans believe that like Antifa was behind it or something like that. Like they have like this really significant misperception because there were these myths going around that, it must have been caused by Antifa. And so they wanted to believe that because that's part of their identity. They don't want to believe that, their team did this really bad event. And so they latch on to this explanatory misinformation that makes them feel better about it. And so then it becomes very hard to dislodge that because it's part of their identity that our team is good. Our team was associated with this bad event. Therefore, there must have been something else that caused it. There's no evidence for that, but it's, because it is, part of the polarization, part of their identity, it's very hard to dislodge that misinformation. So one thing that John Cook and his colleagues came up with is called inoculation theory, which is, good timing since we're all getting inoculated for coronavirus right now. So the idea is that you kind of introduce this kind of weak version of the myth to people. The way you do it is you talk about the fallacy that the misinformation is based on. So, for example, a good example they have is, going back to the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry used fake experts to create doubt in the public mind about the science showing that their product was causing health damages way back in the 1960s. And now the oil and gas industry is using the exact same strategies, using fake experts to make people doubt the experts' agreement on climate science. And so, when people kind of realize that these same strategies are being used, then it makes them angry that they're being duped. And so it's a pretty effective way. If you explain the strategy behind the particular myth, then it's a pretty effective way at helping to dislodge the myth and misinformation. One thing that we're always kind of wrestling with is whether it's worth debunking a particular myth, because if there's like a new myth that comes up, but it's in some dark corner of the internet where very few people have heard about it, and then we debunk it, we might just be elevating it to a higher platform and exposing more people to the myth. And so that's kind of one thing that we want to always consider is like, are we doing more harm than good by debunking a myth? So they created in the Debunking Handbook this flow chart where first, you start off and you hear a new piece of misinformation. First, you ask, like, is it already out there or might it get out there into the public? And if it's not already out there, then you kind of just get ready. You might use it as an example of explaining the misleading techniques behind the myth, but for the most part, you kind of just let it simmer where it's not doing much harm. If it is already out there, then you want to say, okay, well, are very many people aware of it? If it's mostly unknown, then you kind of keep an eye on it. Again, be prepared to debunk it, but you don't want to, raise its profile. If it's gotten traction, then you want to see if like it's already being used to set a certain agenda. Maybe it's being used to attack the Green New Deal or climate policies or something like that. If it is, then okay, you want to go ahead and debunk it. And then we have a specific methodology that seems to be effective in debunking myths, where we call it the myth sandwich, where the first thing you want to do is actually lead with the fact and not with the myth, or even saying like the myth is not true actually reinforces the myth in people's minds. So if the myth is, for example, the sun is causing global warming, if you lead with, like if you're writing an article and your headline is the sun is not causing global warming, that can actually reinforce the myth because people are seeing these words associated, the sun causing global warming. And even if you're saying it's not, again, if especially over time people's memories get fuzzy, they might remember, oh, I read this article, it was talking about the sun and global warming, and I can't remember if it was causing it or not causing it. So it can actually reinforce the myth if you lead with the myth. So you want to lead with the fact, for example, the fact being that either humans are causing global warming or solar activity has declined over the past 60 years, some fact that doesn't reinforce the myth. And then you tackle the myth and explain what the fallacy is behind it. For example, if it's cherry picking data or using fake experts, again, you focus on that, and that helps dislodge the myth from people's minds. And then you end up by repeating the fact. Humans are causing global warming. Here's the evidence. The sun, solar activity has been declining, and kind of reinforce that fact that you led with. And so that seems to be a pretty effective structure for debunking myths. So when we're talking about the strategies and the techniques being used, we came up with this kind of categorization called FLIC. So fake experts are very common, using logical fallacies, a whole bunch of logical fallacies. There's like a hierarchy under that of different logical fallacies that are often used to spread myths. Impossible expectations are common, saying like, well, we don't know for 100% certain that this is true, and therefore, we don't know. Which is not how science works. Science works on, statistics and evidence being a certain strength, but not being certain. There's no certainty in science. Cherry picking is very, very common. People just selecting the one little piece of data that seems to support their myth and ignoring the vast body of the rest of the evidence that refutes the myth. That's very, very common. And then, of course, conspiracy theories. We're seeing a lot of that now, especially with like the QAnon stuff. Conspiracy theories have gotten a lot of traction in recent years, just saying like climate scientists are all biased and they're all trying to, create, socialism and whatnot. So there's a lot of that too. One useful resource, John Cook has come up with this resource called Cranky Uncle. You can go to crankyuncle.com. It is both a book and he's got a cool app, the Cranky Uncle app that you can get from the App Store. Which it's like a game you can play where you're kind of, it'll give you a myth and then you'll have to choose like what is the flick technique, which type of misinformation is it underpinning that myth? Is it cherry picking? Is it using red herrings? Is it fake experts, for example? And so it's a game you can play that also trains you to identify the type of misinformation and the strategy being used. And so he's got this nice video that gives some good examples of this sort of thing. And so I'm going to play it. It's about a 15-minute video. And then after that, we can kind of go into some questions.
Based on the evidence, 97 out of 100 climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. Despite this overwhelming scientific consensus, based on many lines of evidence, a small percentage of the population disagrees with the scientists and denies the science. Science denial has 5 telltale techniques. The first technique of denial is fake experts, people who convey the appearance of expertise without possessing relevant expertise. The Global Warming Petition Project lists 31,000 science graduates disagreeing with human-caused global warming. But 99.9% of the people in the petition have no expertise in climate research. That's fake experts in bulk. The second technique of denial is logical fallacies, such as straw man arguments and red herrings. A red herring is a distraction that has nothing to do with the conclusion. For example, arguing that carbon dioxide takes up a small percentage of the atmosphere, so it can't have a strong effect. But we all know examples in everyday life where a tiny amount has a strong effect. Take blood alcohol, for example. The third technique is impossible expectations, like arguing that global warming doesn't exist because it's cold. Cold weather doesn't disappear during global warming, it's just less likely. This argument also commits the fallacy of cherry picking, the fourth technique of denial. It focuses on select bits of information while denying any science you disagree with. How do you tell the difference between misleading cherry picking and appropriate examples? Someone is cherry picking when the conclusion from a small selection of the available data conflicts with the conclusion from the full body of evidence. The last technique is conspiracy theories, the idea that all the world's scientists are in on a global plot. The problem is you can't change the mind of a conspiracy theorist. Show them evidence to disprove their conspiracy, and they'll say the evidence was part of the conspiracy. Facts bounce off their tinfoil hat. That's the 5 techniques of denial: fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. Knowing these techniques is the first step to building resilience against misinformation and giving science denial the flick. Scientists measure heat building up in the oceans, warming the land, warming the air, and melting ice. They've observed that our planet is building up heat at a rate of at least 4 atomic bombs per second. If you were a cranky uncle wanting to deny the reality of global warming, how do you get around this astounding buildup in heat? Through the technique of cherry picking, focusing on small pieces of data while ignoring the rest of the evidence. Climate deniers argue that surface temperature warming has stopped over a short period, like the last decade or so. How can the surface stop warming if the planet is still building up heat? While the total amount of heat in our climate system steadily builds up, the surface temperature jumps up and down from year to year. This is because heat is constantly sloshing between the ocean and the atmosphere, driven by ocean cycles like El Niño, which is Spanish for the little boy. El Niño sloshes the heat around between the ocean and the atmosphere, causing the surface temperature to jump up and down from year to year. This means a cranky uncle can cherry pick short periods during long-term warming when it looks like warming has paused. This is like being at the bow of a sinking ship and arguing that the ship can't be sinking because you're moving upwards. It's cherry picking from the available evidence while failing to look at the big picture. So to summarize, the key climate fact is that over the past few decades, our planet has been building up heat at a rate of at least 4 atomic bombs per second. The myth is that global warming stopped over the last decade or so. This myth commits the fallacy of cherry picking. It looks at short time periods while ignoring the long-term warming trend. It also focuses on surface temperature while ignoring all the evidence telling us the planet continues to build up heat. Global warming means more hot weather and less cold weather. Across the United States, the proportion of hot record temperatures has been increasing. In the previous decade, there were twice as many hot records as cold ones. But every time it gets cold, you hear a cranky uncle ask, "What happened to global warming?" This commits the fallacy of impossible expectations. Global warming doesn't mean we'll never see cold days. It means hot days are more likely and cold days are less likely. The cold weather argument also commits the anecdote fallacy, a form of cherry picking. It focuses on your personal experience while ignoring what's happening to the whole planet. It's like arguing that at nighttime, the sun doesn't exist. Not falling for this myth is like object permanence, but for adults. So to repeat, the climate fact is that global warming has made hot days more likely and cold days less likely. The myth is that cold weather proves global warming isn't happening. The fallacy is impossible expectations. Global warming doesn't mean cold days never happen, just that they're less likely. This myth also commits the anecdote fallacy. It focuses on personal experience while ignoring the bigger picture. Over the last few decades, the sun has been cooling slightly. What if it keeps cooling? The sun has been cooler before. In the 1600s, the sun went through a period of low activity at the same time as the Little Ice Age. Here is how global temperatures will increase from our greenhouse gas emissions if the sun stays the same. But could a cooling sun be our get-out-of-jail-free card? Well, here is future global warming if the sun's output fell to those low levels from the 1600s. The drop in sunlight would only offset about 1 decade's worth of global warming. Compared with greenhouse warming, the sun is a minor factor. When people argue we're heading into an ice age, this misrepresents how much the sun affects climate change. Greenhouse warming is the main driver of modern climate change. The sun is not our get-out-of-jail-free card. Once again, the climate fact is that even if solar activity dropped, it would only slightly delay global warming from our greenhouse gas emissions. The myth is that we're headed into an ice age due to a cooling sun. This commits the fallacy of misrepresentation, overstating the role of solar activity, which has a minimal effect on climate change compared to greenhouse warming. In 1958, Charles Keeling began measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide, or CO2. He observed that CO2 was rising and falling from year to year. This annual cycle is due to factors like CO2 moving between the atmosphere and vegetation. In spring, plants absorb CO2 out of the air and convert it into foliage. In autumn, the leaves fall and rot, emitting CO2 back into the atmosphere. Keeling also found that over time, the amount of CO2 in the air was increasing. This graph became known as the Keeling curve. It told us that big changes were happening to our atmosphere. For thousands of years, atmospheric CO2 levels remained relatively steady. Nature was in balance, with natural emissions matching natural absorptions. Humans upset the balance during the Industrial Revolution when we began burning fossil fuels. We took carbon that was trapped underground as coal, oil, or gas and burnt it, sending large amounts of CO2 into the air. Now, atmospheric CO2 has increased to levels not seen in millions of years. Cranky uncles try to minimize our role in disrupting the climate system through a crafty piece of cherry picking. They argue that human emissions are small compared to natural emissions. Humans are emitting around 33 billion tonnes of carbon into the air every year, while nature is emitting around 730 billion tonnes of carbon. However, nature also absorbs around 740 billion tonnes of carbon each year. By failing to consider the full picture, this cherry pick ignores that nature was in balance and we upset the natural balance. To summarise, the climate fact is that nature was in balance, with natural CO2 emissions matched by natural absorptions. We upset that balance. The myth is that human CO2 emissions are tiny compared to natural CO2 emissions, so we don't matter. This commits the fallacy of cherry picking, ignoring how natural absorptions match natural emissions. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that traps heat. We can understand the greenhouse effect in 3 easy steps. First, greenhouse gases allow visible light, sunlight, to travel freely to the Earth's surface. Second, the Earth is warmed by sunlight and glows with infrared heat. Third, this infrared heat radiates from the Earth's surface, but greenhouse gases trap the heat, stopping it from escaping to space. This is how the greenhouse effect warms the Earth. It lets sunlight in, then traps heat on the way out. The warming effect of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide has been confirmed by many lines of evidence. Aircraft and satellites measure less heat escaping to space at the exact wavelengths that carbon dioxide absorbs energy. The greenhouse effect is a measured fact. Nevertheless, cranky uncles reject even basic physics like the greenhouse effect. One cranky argument is that carbon dioxide, or CO2, is a small percentage, 0.04% of the atmosphere, so it can't have a significant effect. This is a red herring, an irrelevant point designed to distract. We all know from everyday life that small amounts of an active substance can have a strong effect, whether it be a drop of arsenic in a glass of water or a fraction of a percent of alcohol in our bloodstream. Once again, the fact is that the greenhouse effect is an observed, fact. The myth is that carbon dioxide cannot have a strong effect because it's a trace gas. The fallacy is red herring. The fact that carbon dioxide is a trace gas is irrelevant, as we know small amounts of an active substance can have a strong effect. Throughout Earth's history, there have been periods when climate changed dramatically. Over the last 500,000 years, our planet has transitioned from ice ages to warm periods, then back again. This dramatic ice age cycle was caused by subtle changes in the Earth's orbit. The past sends us a clear message. Our climate is highly sensitive to small changes in heat. The slightest nudge causes a strong reaction. Another way to look at it, our climate system is like a cranky beast which overreacts to even small prods. Right now, we're hitting it with a big stick. The cranky uncles take entirely the wrong message from the past. They argue that climate is changing naturally now because climate changed naturally in the past. This argument commits single cause fallacy, assuming something only has a single cause when there might be multiple factors. It's like arguing that murders don't happen now because people have died of natural causes in the past. In summary, the fact here is that the past warns us that climate will react strongly to all the heat-trapping greenhouse gases we're adding to the atmosphere. The myth is that climate has changed naturally in the past, so current climate change must be natural too. This myth commits single cause fallacy. Just because natural factors have driven climate change in the past doesn't mean it's necessarily natural now. When we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is a heat-trapping gas and causes warming. But when it gets warmer, the oceans release CO2. This is because warmer water can't hold as much dissolved CO2. This results in more CO2 in the air, which results in more heat being trapped and more warming. So more CO2 causes warming, warming causes more CO2, reinforcing feedback. In the past, when the Earth warmed due to factors like wobbles in the Earth's orbit, this caused the oceans to release more CO2. The extra CO2 in the atmosphere added even more warming. This reinforcing feedback was strong enough to pull the Earth out of ice ages. Over the last 500,000 years, climate and CO2 marched together in lockstep. The cranky uncles look at past climate change and come to the wrong conclusion. They argue that in the past, CO2 rose after warming, therefore CO2 can't cause warming. This commits the logical fallacy known as false choice, otherwise known as false dichotomy. A false choice is where you have to choose only one of two options, when both options could be correct, or there could be other options. In the case of CO2 and climate, we know that more CO2 causes warming, and warming causes more CO2. Both options are correct. The false choice fallacy is like arguing that either eggs come out of chickens or chickens come out of eggs. In reality, both are true. Arguing you have to choose one or the other is a false choice. So to recap, the fact is that more CO2 causes warming and warming causes more CO2. Together, this is a reinforcing feedback. The myth is that CO2 lagged behind temperature in the past, so CO2 can't cause warming. This commits the false choice fallacy, insisting only one option can be true, when in reality both options are true.
Okay, so those are some good examples of the fact myth fallacy structure. Definitely check out crankyuncle.com if you can to get the app and potentially the book. Real quickly, this came up at the end of my last talk, what to do about climate deniers, and there's another good group at Yale called Yale Climate Connection, or Yale Climate Communications, that does these good surveys of what the public feels and thinks about climate change. And the good news is that, climate deniers are a pretty small percentage, 8 to 20%, depending on how you categorize them, whereas most people are really at least cautious, concerned, increasingly alarmed about climate change. So we're like much larger numbers than they are. They're very loud and influential, but we've got the numbers on our side. So that's the good news. Like, they're a pretty small percentage. So you don't want to waste too much time arguing with climate deniers because they're the slim minority of people. And then really quickly, I always want to end with what people can do. Definitely get engaged in the political process. Vote for people with climate change candidates who want to do something about climate change. join a grassroots climate group. As I mentioned, Citizens Climate Lobby is really good. Sunrise Movement's doing great stuff. 350, Sierra Club, there's lots of good ones to choose from. Reduce your own personal carbon footprint, eat less meat, especially less beef, use less energy, burn less gas. But most importantly, we need to get collective action. And so, these first two, trying to get engaged in the political sphere and, get as much influence as you can over policymakers is very important. So I want to leave a little time for questions. If you want to email me directly, that's my email address, dana1981 at Yahoo. I'm also Dana1981 on Twitter.